Kansas Territory, 1882. A young woman steps down from the dusty railway car into the blazing heat of an August afternoon. Her gloved hand grips a worn leather satchel containing letters bearing promises of a new life and a loving husband. Her dark eyes scan the crowded platform of Dodge City's train station, searching for the face she has memorized from a single photograph, seeking the future she has traveled nearly 1,000 miles to claim. But fate has other plans, and what awaits her will challenge every assumption about love, loss, and the courage required to forge a life from the ashes of shattered dreams. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun beat mercilessly down on the wooden platform as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her dark blue traveling dress and tried to shield her eyes from the glare. At 24, she possessed a quiet beauty that came more from intelligence and determination than conventional prettiness. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical style beneath a modest bonnet, and her brown eyes held a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy that had sustained her throughout the 3-day journey from St. Louis, the locomotive behind. Her hissed and groaned as workers unloaded freight and passengers prepared for the train's continuation westward. Dodge City sprawled before her in all its raw frontier glory, a collection of wooden buildings, wide streets churned to dust by countless cattle drives, and the constant movement of cowboys, merchants, and settlers pursuing their various fortunes. On the edge of civilization, Sarah clutched her satchel tighter, feeling the reassuring weight of the letters inside. 18 months of correspondence with William Harper had brought her to this moment. His careful handwriting had painted pictures of a modest but growing ranch outside Dodge City, of cattle herds and vast prairie skies, of a life built on honest work and shared dreams. More importantly, his letters had revealed a thoughtful man who valued her opinions on everything from literature to livestock management, who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts rather than merely seeking a frontier housekeeper. Dodge City, called the conductor, though most passengers had already disembarked. Sarah straightened her shoulders and stepped fully onto the platform, her small trunk and carpet bag beside her, containing everything she owned in the world. The crowd around the station was unlike anything she had experienced in St. Louis. Cowboys in chaps and spurs mingled with well-dressed cattle buyers, their conversations punctuated by the lowing of cattle from the holding pens nearby. The smell of dust, animals, and human sweat created an overwhelming sensory experience that made Sarah momentarily dizzy. She had expected Billy Harper to meet her personally. His last letter had been quite specific about the date and time, promising to be waiting with a smile and a small bouquet of prairie flowers. But as the platform gradually emptied and no familiar face approached, a familiar knot of anxiety began forming in her stomach. "Ma'am, you need assistance?" A young man approached, tipping his hat respectfully. He couldn't have been more than 16, with the eager expression of someone looking to earn a few coins through helpful service. "Yes, thank you." Sarah reached into her reticule for a nickel. "I'm looking for Mr. William Harper. He was supposed to meet me here today." The boy's expression shifted, becoming suddenly uncomfortable. "Harper, you said? Billy Harper from the spread east of town?" "Yes, exactly." Relief flooded through Sarah. "Do you know him? Perhaps he was delayed?" The young man shuffled his feet, clearly struggling with something. "Ma'am, I think you ought to speak to Mr. Coleman over at the cattle company office. He'd be able to tell you about Mr. Harper better than I could." This was not the response Sarah had hoped for, but she pressed on. "Could you direct me to this Mr. Coleman's office? Just down the street there, next to the bank. Big sign says Coleman Cattle Company." The boy gestured toward the main street. "Ma'am, I can carry your trunk for another nickel." Sarah agreed, though her unease was growing with each passing moment. The boy shouldered her trunk with practiced ease, and they made their way down the dusty main street of Dodge City. The Coleman Cattle Company occupied a substantial wooden building with large windows and a covered porch. Through the glass, Sarah could see maps on the walls and several men in conversation around a large desk. The boy set down her trunk and collected his payment before disappearing back toward the station. Sarah took a deep breath and entered the office. The conversation ceased as she stepped inside, and three men turned to regard her with various degrees of curiosity and surprise. The office smelled of leather, coffee, and the distinctive odor of cattle that seemed to permeate everything in Dodge City. "Gentlemen," she said, removing her bonnet and smoothing her hair, "I'm looking for Mr. Coleman. I was told he might have information about Mr. William Harper." The tallest of the three men stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal dark hair, streaked with premature gray at the temples. He was perhaps 30 years old, with weathered features that spoke of long hours in the sun and wind. His blue eyes held a directness that was both reassuring and slightly intimidating. "I'm Jake Coleman, ma'am. And you are?" "Sarah Mitchell. I've traveled from St. Louis to meet Mr. Harper. We've been corresponding for over a year, and he was supposed to meet by train this afternoon." She reached into her satchel, withdrawing a packet of letters. "These are his letters, if that helps establish his identity." Something passed across Coleman's face, an expression that made Sarah's heart begin to race with anticipation of bad news. He gestured toward a chair near his desk. "Miss Mitchell, please sit down. I'm afraid I have some difficult news regarding Billy Harper." Sarah remained standing, her spine straight with the kind of determination that had sustained her through previous challenges. "Has something happened to him?" Coleman exchanged glances with his companions, then faced her directly. "Billy Harper was killed 3 weeks ago in a cattle stampede. I'm very sorry to be the one to tell you." The words hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. She sank into the offered chair, her mind struggling to process this information. "Killed? But I received a letter from him just 2 weeks ago, confirming my arrival date." Coleman's frown deepened. "That's impossible, Miss Mitchell. Billy died on July 20th. I was there. My cattle and his got mixed up during a river crossing. And when the herd spooked, Billy was caught in the middle trying to separate them. He died instantly." Sarah opened her satchel with trembling fingers, withdrawing the most recent letter. "This is dated July 25th, 5 days after the date you mentioned." Coleman examined the letter, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "This is Billy's handwriting, or a very good imitation of it. But I can assure you, Miss Mitchell, William Harper has been buried in Dodge City Cemetery for 3 weeks. "Then who has been writing to me?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "That's exactly what I intend to find out." Coleman's voice carried an edge of anger that hadn't been there before. "Billy was a good man, and if someone's been using his name to deceive you, they're going to answer for it." Sarah stared at the letter in Coleman's hands, trying to comprehend the magnitude of her situation. She had spent her life savings on the journey to Kansas. She had sold her few possessions, said goodbye to everyone she knew in St. Louis, and committed herself to a future with a man who had been dead for weeks while someone else continued their correspondence. "Miss Mitchell," Coleman said gently, "do you have family in St. Louis you can return to?" The question forced Sarah to confront the full reality of her circumstances. "No, my father died last year, and I have no other family. That's why I decided to answer Mr. Harper's advertisement for a mail-order bride." She had been working as a seamstress in St. Louis, barely earning enough to pay for a small room in a boarding house, when her father's illness consumed their modest savings and his death left her completely alone. Billy Harper's letters had seemed like a gift from Providence, a chance for a new life, a loving husband, and the kind of security she had never known. Coleman was studying her with an expression that combined sympathy with something else, a growing determination that suggested he was forming some kind of plan. "Miss Mitchell, I take some responsibility for what happened to Billy. The stampede occurred when our herds got mixed together during a river crossing. My men and I were managing the situation, but Billy rode into the middle of it trying to save some of his breeding stock. Coleman's voice carried the weight of genuine regret. If I had been more careful about keeping our herds separated, he might still be alive. You can't blame yourself for an accident, Mr. Coleman. Sarah's response was automatic, though. Her mind was elsewhere, trying to process the implications of her situation. Maybe not, but I can take responsibility for helping you now. Coleman turned to his companions. Tom, ride out to the Harper place and see what you can find. Check if anyone's been living there or handling Billy's mail. Frank, ask around town if anyone knows who might have been answering letters in Billy's name. The two men nodded and departed, leaving Sarah alone with Coleman in the office that suddenly seemed much larger and more intimidating. Mr. Coleman, I appreciate your concern, but I can't become your responsibility. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I need to understand my options and make my own decisions. Coleman nodded approvingly. That's exactly what Billy said you were like in his letters. Independent and strong-minded. He admired those qualities. He spoke of me to you often. Billy was excited about your arrival, talked about it every time I saw him. He showed me your photograph and read parts of your letters. Coleman's expression softened. He was genuinely fond of you, Miss Mitchell. Whatever deception happened after his death, his original feelings were real. This information provided some comfort, though it didn't solve Sarah's immediate problems. She was stranded in Dodge City with limited funds and no clear path forward. Did Mr. Harper own property here? She asked, trying to focus on practical matters. A small ranch about 10 miles east of town. Nothing fancy, but it was his, and he was building it up slowly. Problem is, without a will, it'll probably go to his nearest relative. I think he mentioned a cousin in Missouri, but they weren't close. Sarah absorbed this information while considering her limited options. Return to St. Louis meant admitting failure and facing poverty again. But staying in Dodge City without clear prospects seemed equally daunting. Mr. Coleman, you mentioned that your cattle were involved in the stampede that killed Mr. Harper. What kind of responsibility do you feel for that situation? Coleman met her gaze directly. Billy died trying to save stock that was valuable to him. My company's operations contributed to the conditions that led to his death. In my mind, that creates an obligation to help those he left behind. And what form would that help take? Coleman hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. I've been thinking about that since Tom and Frank left. My cattle company has been successful, but I've been operating without sufficient investment capital. I bid on contracts that require significant upfront funding, and I've had to turn down profitable opportunities because I couldn't cover the initial costs. Sarah waited for him to continue, sensing that he was building toward something significant. You came here expecting to be Billy's partner in life and business. While I can't replace what you've lost, I could offer you a different kind of partnership. Investment in my cattle operations in exchange for a share of the profits. The proposition was unexpected but not entirely unwelcome. Sarah had assisted her father with his grain business before his death, keeping books and managing correspondence with suppliers. She understood the basics of business operations, even if cattle were unfamiliar territory. What kind of investment? Are you talking about, Mr. Coleman? That would depend on what resources you have available. Billy mentioned that your family had some means, though he never specified amounts. Sarah considered how much to reveal. Her father's grain business had been modestly successful, and his life insurance policy had left her with nearly $2,000, a substantial sum by frontier standards. But revealing her full financial situation to a man she had just met seemed unwise. I have some capital available, she said carefully. But I would need to understand your business operations thoroughly before making any commitment. That's reasonable. Would you be willing to stay in Dodge City long enough for me to show you how the cattle business works? I can arrange lodging at Mrs. Hayes' boarding house. She runs a respectable establishment for travelers and business visitors. The offer provided a temporary solution while Sarah considered her options. It also gave her time to discover who had been writing letters in Billy Harper's name and why. That seems sensible, Mr. Coleman. But I want to be clear that any business arrangement would be exactly that, a business arrangement. I'm not interested in replacing one mail-order situation with another. Coleman actually smiled at this, the first time his serious expression had lightened since they'd begun talking. Miss Mitchell, I can assure you that marriage wasn't part of my business proposal. I've got enough complications in my life without adding romantic entanglements to my cattle operations. Something in his tone suggested that there was a story behind that statement, but Sarah didn't press for details. Instead, she focused on the practical aspects of his offer. Very well. I'll stay for a trial period to learn about your business and consider whether an investment partnership makes sense for both of us. But I reserve the right to leave whenever I choose, and any financial arrangements would be documented in proper legal contracts. Agreed. Now let me escort you to Mrs. Hayes' establishment and get you settled. Tomorrow I can show you my operations and explain how cattle companies work in Kansas territory. As they left the office together, Sarah carrying her carpet bag while Coleman managed her trunk, she reflected on the unexpected turn her life had taken in just one afternoon. She had arrived in Dodge City expecting to meet her intended husband and begin a new life as a rancher's wife. Instead, she had discovered that her intended was dead, that someone had been impersonating him in letters, and that she was now considering a business partnership with a trail boss who felt responsible for her predicament. Mrs. Hayes' boarding house proved to be a substantial two-story building with a wide front porch and flower boxes that suggested its proprietor took pride in appearances. Dorothy Hayes herself was a woman of perhaps 50, with gray-streaked brown hair and the kind of competent demeanor that suggested she could handle whatever challenges frontier life presented. Mr. Coleman, she greeted them as they approached the front steps. And this must be the young lady you sent word about. Mrs. Hayes, may I present Miss Sarah Mitchell from St. Louis. She'll be staying with you while she considers some business opportunities in Dodge City. Mrs. Hayes studied Sarah with the shrewd assessment of someone who had learned to judge character quickly and accurately. Whatever she saw apparently met with approval, because her expression warmed into genuine welcome. Miss Mitchell, you're most welcome. I have a lovely room on the second floor with its own window facing east. You'll catch the morning light and the evening breeze. The rate is $2 per week, including breakfast and supper. That sounds perfect, Mrs. Hayes. Thank you. As they climbed the stairs to examine the room, Sarah caught fragments of conversation between Coleman and Mrs. Hayes that suggested the boarding house operator was well informed about local business matters. This could prove valuable if Sarah decided to establish herself in Dodge City's commercial community. The room itself was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, small wardrobe, and a wooden chair positioned near the window. White cotton curtains framed the view of Dodge City's main street and the prairie beyond. Will this suit your needs? Mrs. Hayes asked. It's perfect. Thank you for accommodating me on such short notice. After Mrs. Hayes departed to prepare supper, Coleman lingered in the doorway. Miss Mitchell, I know this day hasn't unfolded as you expected. I want you to know that I meant what I said about taking responsibility for helping you establish yourself here. Billy Harper was a good man, and he deserved better than what happened to him. You deserve better too. Sarah appreciated his sincerity, though she remained cautious about depending too heavily on anyone else's sense of obligation. Mr. Coleman, I'm grateful for your assistance. But I need you to understand that I make my own decisions based on my own assessment of situations. I won't be anyone's charity case or responsibility." Coleman nodded with what appeared to be respect. "I wouldn't expect anything less. Billy said you had backbone, and I can see he was right about that." After he left, Sarah sat by the window watching the street below as evening approached. Cowboys rode past in small groups, their day's work finished, heading toward the saloons and entertainment that Dodge City provided for men who spent months on the trail. Merchants closed their shops, and families emerged for evening strolls. Along the wooden sidewalks, she thought about Billy Harper, the man she had never met, but had grown to care for through his letters. His death was tragic, but someone's decision to impersonate him afterward was both cruel and puzzling. Who would benefit from deceiving a mail-order bride? What could they hope to gain? These questions would need answers, but not tonight. Tonight, she needed to process the complete upheaval of her expectations and begin planning for an uncertain future. She had come to Kansas territory seeking security and companionship through marriage. Instead, she was contemplating a business partnership that could either provide the independence she had never dared to hope for, or leave her worse off than when she started. As darkness fell over Dodge City, Sarah unpacked her few belongings and prepared for her first night in what might or might not become her new home. Whatever challenges awaited, she would face them with the same determination that had brought her this far. The frontier demanded nothing less than complete commitment to whatever path one chose to walk. Through her window, she could hear the distant sounds of cattle in the holding pens and the occasional whistle of a train departing for destinations unknown. These were the sounds of her new world, so different from the familiar rhythms of St. Louis. Whether she stayed or left, Sarah Mitchell would never again be the same woman who had stepped off the train that afternoon, full of hope and naive expectations. The transformation had already begun, and there was no turning back. Dawn broke over Dodge City with the harsh clarity that only prairie sunrise could provide. Sarah Mitchell stood at her window, already dressed in her most practical attire, watching the street below come alive with the daily rhythm of frontier commerce. Cowboys emerged from hotels and boarding houses, merchants opened their establishments, and the sound of cattle in the distant pens created a constant backdrop to the human activity. She had slept little, her mind churning with questions about Billy Harper's death and the mysterious continuation of their correspondence. More immediately, she needed to understand Jake Coleman's cattle business before making any decisions about investment or partnership. A soft knock at her door announced Mrs. Hayes with a basin of fresh water and a clean towel. The boarding house keeper's efficiency impressed Sarah, reminding her of the competent women who had managed successful businesses alongside their husbands in St. Louis. "Mr. Coleman sent word he'll be here at 7 to escort you to breakfast and show you his operations," Mrs. Hayes informed her. "He's a reliable man, Miss Mitchell. Lost his wife 2 years back in a fever epidemic. Been throwing himself into his work ever since." This information added context to Coleman's earlier comment about complications in his life. Sarah had wondered about his personal circumstances, particularly why a successful businessman in his 30s remained unmarried in a territory where eligible men vastly outnumbered available women. "Thank you for the information, Mrs. Hayes. It helps to understand the people I'm dealing with. Knowledge is currency on the frontier, my dear. The more you understand about local personalities and relationships, the better equipped you'll be to make sound decisions." Coleman arrived precisely at 7, dressed in clean work clothes and carrying his hat respectfully in his hand. His punctuality and attention to proper courtesy suggested a man who took business commitments seriously, traits Sarah valued from her experience with her father's grain operations. "Miss Mitchell, I hope you rested well. I thought we might breakfast at the hotel dining room before heading out to see my cattle operations." The hotel dining room bustled with cattlemen, railroad representatives, and traveling merchants conducting business over eggs and coffee. Sarah noticed how various men nodded respectfully to Coleman as they passed, indicating his reputation within the community's commercial circles. Over a substantial meal of bacon, eggs, biscuits, and surprisingly good coffee, Coleman outlined his business operations with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to explaining complex matters to potential investors. The Coleman Cattle Company handles 3 primary activities, he began, sketching rough diagrams on a piece of paper. We contract with ranchers to drive their herds to railroad terminals. We maintain our own breeding stock for sale to new ranchers. And we provide consulting services to Eastern investors looking to establish cattle operations in Kansas Territory. Sarah studied the diagrams, her mind automatically analyzing the business model. What are your primary costs and profit margins for each activity? Coleman's eyebrows rose slightly, apparently surprised by the directness of her financial inquiry. Trail driving contracts typically run $1,500 to $3,000, depending on herd size and destination. Our costs include wages for 8 to 12 cowboys, supplies and equipment. Profit margins run about 30% if weather and market conditions cooperate. And if they don't cooperate? Last year we lost money on 2 contracts due to severe storms that scattered herds and delayed delivery. The year before, a cholera outbreak in Chicago closed the stockyards for 3 weeks, forcing us to hold cattle at our own expense. Sarah appreciated his honesty about the risks involved. Too many business propositions she had encountered glossed over potential problems in favor of highlighting opportunities. What about your breeding operations? We maintain about 200 head of prime breeding stock. Bulls sell for $75 to $100 each. Breeding cows for $35 to $50. The challenge is having sufficient pasture and winter feed to maintain quality animals. Which brings us to land ownership and grazing rights. Sarah observed. Coleman nodded approvingly. Exactly. We lease grazing land from several ranchers, but having our own property would provide better control over feed quality and breeding conditions. And the consulting work? Eastern investors often want to establish cattle operations without understanding frontier conditions. We charge consultation fees to help them avoid costly mistakes, sometimes taking partnership stakes in successful operations. Sarah absorbed this information while considering the investment implications. Coleman's business model appeared sound, but success clearly depended on factors beyond his control: weather, disease, market fluctuations, and the availability of suitable land. Mr. Coleman, what specific investment are you seeking, and what returns would you project? Coleman set down his coffee cup and met her gaze directly. I need working capital to expand our breeding operations and purchase grazing land. $5,000 would allow us to double our herd size and acquire permanent pasture. I'd project returns of 20 to 25% annually, assuming normal market conditions. $5,000 represented more than double Sarah's available funds. However, she had learned from her father never to reveal her financial limitations immediately in business negotiations. That's a substantial investment requiring careful consideration. I'd need to examine your books, understand your contracts, and see your operations firsthand before making any decisions. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. Would you be willing to ride out to our main holding area today? It's about 8 miles northwest of town, where we keep our breeding stock and conduct most of our training operations. Sarah had limited experience with horseback riding, having lived most of her life in urban St. Louis. However, she had ridden occasionally in the city's parks and felt confident she could manage a gentle horse for the distance. Coleman described, I'd be pleased to see your operations, though I should mention my riding experience is limited to city parks and short recreational outings. We'll use the wagon for today's trip. Easier for conversation, and I can show you more of the surrounding area. After breakfast, Coleman escorted Sarah to a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 reliable-looking horses. The conveyance was practical rather than elegant, clearly designed for frontier business rather than social calls. He helped her onto the coupe bench seat with courteous efficiency, then climbed up beside her and guided the horses toward Dodge City's outskirts. The Kansas prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by occasional creek beds marked by cottonwood trees and distant ranch buildings. The landscape's vastness both thrilled and intimidated Sarah, who had never seen such expanses of open country. "Take some getting used to," Coleman observed, noting her reaction to the scenery. "People from back east often find the emptiness overwhelming at first. It's beautiful, but I can understand how someone could feel lost in all this space. How do you navigate without landmarks?" "Experience mostly, plus reading the subtle changes in terrain and vegetation. After a few years, you develop an instinct for direction and distance." As they traveled, Coleman pointed out various features of the landscape: the difference between good and poor grazing land, the importance of water sources, and the challenges of winter feeding when snow covered the grass for extended periods. "Billy Harper's ranch is about 2 miles north of our main operation," he mentioned as they crested a low ridge. "Tom rode out there yesterday, but found the buildings empty. No sign of anyone living there recently." "What about his cattle and equipment?" "That's the strange part. His herd is still grazing in his home pasture, but someone's been caring for them. The animals look healthy and well tended, which means somebody's been checking on them regularly since Billy's death." This information added another puzzle to the mystery of who had been writing letters in Billy Harper's name. Caring for livestock required daily attention and considerable knowledge. It wasn't something a casual imposter could manage without detection. The Coleman Cattle Company's main operation impressed Sarah with its scale and organization. Sturdy corrals held several dozen cattle, while a long barn provided shelter and feed storage. A bunkhouse accommodated the cowboys, and a separate building served as office space and equipment storage. Coleman introduced Sarah to his foreman, Tom Bradley, a weathered man in his 40s who managed day-to-day operations with quiet competence. Bradley's respectful but reserved manner toward Sarah suggested he was still assessing this unexpected female visitor to their male-dominated business. "Tom, show Miss Mitchell our breeding stock while I check the morning reports." Bradley led Sarah through the corrals, explaining the characteristics that made certain animals valuable for breeding purposes. His knowledge impressed her, though his initial wariness gradually gave way to surprised approval as Sarah asked intelligent questions about bloodlines, feed requirements, and market demands. "Most Eastern folks don't understand that cattle ranching is as much science as labor," Bradley observed as they examined a particularly impressive bull. "Mr. Coleman mentioned you might be interested in investing in our operations. I'm considering it, though I need to understand all aspects of the business before making any commitments." Bradley nodded approvingly. "Smart approach. Lot of Eastern money got lost out here by folks who figured cattle ranching was simple. It ain't." Coleman joined them as they completed the tour of the breeding operation. His morning reports had apparently contained good news, as his expression seemed more relaxed than it had been the previous day. "Our contracts for next month's drives are all confirmed," he reported. 3 herds totaling about 4,000 head, destination Abilene. "Good prices locked in, assuming we deliver on schedule." "What could prevent on-schedule delivery?" Sarah asked. "Weather, primarily. Late summer storms can scatter herds and add days to the drive. River crossings can be dangerous if water levels are high. Occasionally we encounter problems with rustlers or hostile Indians, though that's less common now than it was 5 years ago." Bradley excused himself to check on the cowboys training young horses, leaving Sarah and Coleman alone near the main corral. The afternoon sun beat down intensely, and Sarah was grateful for the shade provided by the barn's overhang. "Miss Mitchell." I want to be completely honest about the risks involved in cattle ranching. It's not a business for someone who needs guaranteed returns or predictable income. Sarah appreciated his candor, though she wondered if he was trying to discourage her investment for reasons beyond simple honesty. Mr. Coleman, I understand that frontier businesses involve risks that don't exist in established Eastern markets. What I need to determine is whether those risks are manageable through careful planning and adequate capital reserves. That's the right way to think about it. Billy Harper understood that balance. He never expanded faster than he could sustain a bad year or two. Tell me more about Mr. Harper's approach. Since I was supposed to be his partner, understanding his methods might help me evaluate your proposition. Coleman leaned against the corral fence, his expression thoughtful. Billy was cautious, maybe too cautious. He'd been building his operation slowly for 3 years, never borrowing money or taking risks that could cost him everything. Smart approach, but it limited his growth potential. Whereas your approach involves more aggressive expansion. Not reckless, but more willing to leverage opportunities when they arise. The cattle industry is growing rapidly in Kansas territory. Ranchers who position themselves correctly now will dominate the market in 5 years. Sarah understood the appeal of Coleman's vision, though her father had taught her to be wary of business propositions that relied heavily on future market projections. What evidence do you have that the market will continue expanding at current rates? Coleman smiled at her question, clearly pleased by her analytical approach. Railroad expansion primarily. New rail lines are opening markets that were previously inaccessible. Eastern cities are growing rapidly, creating increased demand for beef. And the government's Indian policies are opening millions of acres for cattle grazing. These were compelling arguments, though Sarah knew that market conditions could change rapidly due to economic panics, political shifts, or technological developments. Mr. Coleman, I'd like to examine your financial records and contracts before making any investment decisions. Would you be willing to provide that documentation? Absolutely. I have 3 years of detailed records in my office back in town. You're welcome to review everything. As they prepared to return to Dodge City, Sarah reflected on what she had learned during the day. Coleman's business appeared legitimate and potentially profitable, though it clearly involved substantial risks. His personal character seemed solid, and his employees respected him. Most importantly, he treated her as a serious business partner, rather than a charity case or romantic prospect. The wagon ride back to town provided an opportunity for more personal conversation. Sarah found herself curious about Coleman's background and the experiences that had shaped his approach to business and life. Have you always been involved in cattle ranching, Mr. Coleman? Started as a cowboy working other men's ranches. Saved my earnings and gradually built up enough capital to start contracting trail drives. My wife encouraged the expansion into breeding operations before she died. Mrs. Hayes mentioned you lost your wife to fever. That must have been difficult. Coleman's hands tightened slightly on the reins, the only sign that the topic still caused him pain. Mary had plans for expanding our operations, ideas about breeding programs and land acquisition. After she died, throwing myself into work seemed better than dwelling on what might have been. Sarah understood that kind of grief, having experienced similar feelings after her father's death. Work provided structure and purpose when personal loss threatened to overwhelm rational thought. Is that why you offered me a business partnership rather than other arrangements? Coleman glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Partly. I'm not ready for personal complications, and you made it clear you weren't seeking another mail order situation. A business partnership seemed like it could benefit both of us without creating emotional entanglements. That's honest, though I should point out that business partnerships can create their own complications. True, but those are complications I know how to handle. Romantic relationships. He trailed off, leaving the sentence incomplete. They spent the remainder of the journey discussing practical matters, the logistics of cattle drives, seasonal variations in feed costs, and the political factors that affected ranching operations. Coleman's knowledge impressed Sarah, while her questions apparently convinced him that she understood business principles beyond what most Eastern women of her background would know. By the time they reached Dodge City, Sarah had formed a preliminary opinion about Coleman's proposition. The business opportunity seemed legitimate and potentially profitable, though it would require careful management and adequate capital reserves to weather inevitable setbacks. Coleman himself appeared competent and trustworthy, if somewhat guarded about personal matters. "Mr. Coleman, I'd like to review your financial records tomorrow morning. If everything appears satisfactory, I may be interested in discussing specific investment terms." "That's exactly what I hope to hear. I'll have all the documentation ready for your review." As Coleman helped Sarah down from the wagon outside Mrs. Hayes' boarding house, she noticed a well-dressed stranger watching them from across the street. The man's attention seemed focused specifically on her, his gaze following her movements with uncomfortable intensity. "Mr. Coleman, do you know that gentleman across the street? The one in the dark suit?" Coleman followed her gaze, his expression immediately hardening. "That's Marcus Whitfield, Billy Harper's former business partner. I didn't know he was in town." "Business partner?" Billy never mentioned a partner in his letters. "They had a falling out about 6 months ago over some land deal. Billy bought him out and they went their separate ways, though not on friendly terms." Sarah studied Whitfield's face, noting his expensive clothing and calculating expression. Something about his presence in Dodge City, particularly his interest in her arrival, seemed more than coincidental. "Mr. Coleman, I think I'd like to meet Mr. Whitfield. If he was Billy's partner, he might have information about who's been writing those letters." Coleman's expression suggested he didn't think that was a particularly good idea, but he nodded. Slowly, "If you're determined to speak with him, I'll accompany you. Marcus Whitfield isn't someone a lady should meet alone." They crossed the street together, approaching Whitfield with the kind of careful formality that frontier business required. The man's smile as they approached didn't reach his eyes, and Sarah immediately sensed an underlying hostility beneath his polished exterior. "Jake Coleman," Whitfield said, extending his hand with practiced courtesy. "I heard you were showing our Eastern visitor around your operations. Marcus." Coleman's greeting was notably cool. "Miss Mitchell, may I present Marcus Whitfield?" "Marcus, this is Miss Sarah Mitchell from St. Louis." "Miss Mitchell, what a pleasure. I understand you were corresponding with poor Billy Harper before his unfortunate accident." Something in Whitfield's tone set Sarah's teeth on edge, though she couldn't identify exactly what disturbed her about his manner. "Yes, Mr. Harper and I had been corresponding for over a year. His death was quite a shock." "I'm sure it was. Billy spoke of you often during our business association. Such a shame that his correspondence had to end so abruptly." Coleman stepped slightly closer to Sarah, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Whitfield. "Actually, Mr. Whitfield, that's what we wanted to discuss with you. Miss Mitchell received a letter supposedly from Billy dated 5 days after his death. Do you know anything about that?" Whitfield's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, becoming more guarded. "How strange. Perhaps there was some confusion with the Postal Service. The letter contained specific references to my travel plans and arrival date," Sarah interjected. "It wasn't a delayed delivery of old correspondence." "Well, that is mysterious. I'm afraid I can't shed any light on such an unusual situation." Despite his denial, Sarah sensed that Whitfield knew more than he was revealing. His body language and tone suggested someone carefully controlling his responses, rather than someone genuinely puzzled by unexpected information. "Mr. Whitfield, were you aware that someone has been maintaining Billy's cattle since his death? The animals are healthy and well cared for." This question clearly caught Whitfield off guard. His composed expression slipped momentarily before he recovered his equilibrium. "I hadn't heard that." Perhaps one of his hired hands stayed on to look after things until the estate is settled. Billy didn't have any hired hands, Coleman stated. Flatly, he worked his ranch alone except during roundup, when he hired temporary help. The conversation was clearly making Whitfield uncomfortable, though he maintained his pleasant facade with practiced skill. "Gentlemen, Miss Mitchell, I'm afraid I have an appointment that I must keep. Perhaps we can continue this discussion another time." "Perhaps," Coleman replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly interested in further conversation with Whitfield. As the well-dressed man departed, Sarah watched his movements carefully. Something about his hasty retreat confirmed her suspicion that he was involved in the mystery of Billy Harper's continued correspondence. "Mr. Coleman, what exactly was the nature of the business dispute between Billy and Mr. Whitfield?" Coleman's expression remained troubled as he watched Whitfield disappear around a corner. "Land deal involving some prime grazing acreage north of Billy's ranch. Whitfield claimed he had verbal agreements with the seller, but Billy showed up with a written contract and cash payment. Whitfield accused Billy of underhanded dealing, though I never believed that. Could Whitfield have been trying to get revenge by interfering with Billy's mail-order bride correspondence? It's possible, though I can't figure out what he'd gain from it. Unless—" Coleman paused, his frown deepening. "Unless what?" "Unless he was planning to claim Billy's ranch somehow. If you had arrived expecting to marry Billy, and if—" Whitfield presented himself as the logical person to help you settle Billy's affairs. Sarah completed the thought. "He could have gained control of both Billy's property and my resources. A sophisticated confidence game. That would explain why someone continued the correspondence after Billy's death. Keep you coming to Dodge City, but arranged to intercept you before you learned the truth about Billy's death." The implications of this theory were disturbing. If Coleman's suspicions were correct, Whitfield had been planning to defraud Sarah from the moment Billy Harper died, possibly longer. "Mr. Coleman, I think I need to understand much more about Mr. Whitfield's current circumstances and his relationship with Billy before I can make any decisions about staying in Dodge City. I agree completely. And I think we should be very careful about what information we share publicly until we understand what we're dealing with." As they stood on the main street of Dodge City, watching the evening activities of a frontier town, Sarah realized that her situation had become far more complicated than a simple business investment decision. Someone had been planning to defraud her, and that someone was still in town, still watching her movements, still potentially dangerous. The partnership with Jake Coleman had begun as a practical solution to her immediate problems. Now it was beginning to look like the foundation for something much more significant. Alliance against an adversary who had underestimated both her intelligence and her determination to protect herself. Whatever Marcus Whitfield had planned for the naive mail-order bride he expected to arrive in Dodge City, he was about to discover that Sarah Mitchell was not nearly as vulnerable as he had assumed. The next morning brought unseasonable heat even before sunrise. Sarah woke to find her room stifling despite the open window, and she could hear cattle lowing restlessly in the distant pens. Mrs. Hayes knocked softly at her door, bearing the usual basin of fresh water along with an unexpected message. "Miss Mitchell, there's a gentleman downstairs asking to speak with you. Says his name is Charles Blackwood and that he's traveled from St. Louis on urgent business matters." Sarah's blood ran cold. Charles Blackwood had been her father's junior partner in the grain business, a smooth-talking man who had made increasingly uncomfortable advances after her father's death. She had assumed her departure from St. Louis would end his unwelcome attentions, but apparently he had followed her to Kansas territory. "Did he say what kind of business matters, Mrs. Hayes?" "Something about settling your father's estate properly. He seems quite insistent that there were irregularities in how things were handled." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Blackwood had no legitimate claim on her father's business, but he was clever enough to fabricate official-sounding legal complications. His presence in Dodge City meant her problems were multiplying rapidly. Please tell Mr. Blackwood I'll meet with him in the hotel dining room in 1 hour. And Mrs. Hayes, would you send word to Mr. Coleman that I need to speak with him urgently? Of course, dear. Should I be concerned about this gentleman's intentions? I'm not certain yet, but I'd prefer to meet with him in a public place, with witnesses present. After Mrs. Hayes departed, Sarah dressed carefully in her most businesslike attire, a gray wool dress with minimal ornamentation that conveyed seriousness rather than femininity. If Blackwood had come to Dodge City expecting to intimidate a helpless woman, he was about to discover his mistake. Coleman arrived at the boarding house within 30 minutes, his expression grim after receiving her message. He had clearly ridden hard from his ranch, and dust covered his clothes and hat. Mrs. Hayes said someone from St. Louis is here claiming business with your father's estate. Should I be worried? Charles Blackwood was my father's junior partner, though he had no ownership stake in the company. After my father died, he made it clear he expected to acquire both the business and me through marriage. I left St. Louis partly to avoid his pressure. Coleman's jaw tightened. And now he's tracked you here. What kind of man follows a woman 1,500 miles to continue unwelcome courtship? The kind who sees marriage as a business transaction rather than a personal relationship. Charles has expensive tastes and limited capital. My inheritance would solve both problems for him. What's your strategy for dealing with him? Sarah appreciated that Coleman asked about her strategy rather than assuming he needed to protect her from the situation. Direct confrontation. Let him state his claims publicly, then demolish them with facts. The more witnesses present, the better. I'll stay close during your meeting. Blackwood may not try anything inappropriate in public, but having support nearby can't hurt. They walked to the hotel together, Sarah's mind organizing arguments and evidence she might need to counter whatever fabrications Blackwood had prepared. The dining room was busily occupied with the usual collection of cattlemen, railroad representatives, and traveling merchants, providing exactly the kind of public setting she wanted for this confrontation. Charles Blackwood occupied a corner table, dressed in an expensive Eastern suit that looked ridiculous in the frontier setting. He was perhaps 40 years old, with carefully groomed dark hair and the soft appearance of someone who avoided physical labor. His smile as Sarah approached held the predatory quality she remembered with distaste. Sarah, my dear, you look well despite this harsh frontier climate. He rose and attempted to take her hand, which she smoothly avoided by adjusting her reticule. Charles, this is an unexpected surprise. May I present Mr. Jake Coleman, my business associate? Jake, this is Charles Blackwood from St. Louis. Coleman nodded curtly but didn't offer his hand. His presence seemed to make Blackwood slightly nervous, though the man recovered his composure quickly. Business associate? How fascinating. I wasn't aware you had ventured into commerce, Sarah. There are many things about my current circumstances you're not aware of. Charles, Mrs. Hayes mentioned you had urgent business matters to discuss regarding my father's estate. Blackwood gestured for them to sit, clearly intending to control the conversation's direction. Indeed, most urgent. I've discovered serious irregularities in how your father's affairs were settled. It appears certain legal requirements were not properly observed. Sarah remained standing, forcing Blackwood to look up at her. What specific irregularities? The business transfer, for one thing. Your father promised me partnership and eventual ownership in exchange for my investment of time and capital over 3 years. His will doesn't reflect those verbal agreements. Because no such agreements existed beyond your wishful thinking, my father's will was properly executed and witnessed. The business transfer to me was legally recorded with the appropriate authorities. Blackwood's expression hardened slightly, though he maintained his pleasant tone. My dear, these are complex legal matters that require professional handling. I've taken the liberty of consulting attorneys who specialize in estate disputes. They believe we can challenge the will's validity. Coleman finally spoke, his voice carrying quiet menace. On what grounds would you challenge a properly executed will? Undue influence, for one thing. A dying man might not have been thinking clearly about complex business decisions. And there's the question of Sarah's competence to manage substantial commercial enterprises. The suggestion that she was incompetent to manage her own inheritance sparked Sarah's anger into cold fury. Charles, let me make something perfectly clear. My father was mentally competent until the day he died. The business transfer was his deliberate decision, made to ensure his daughter's independence. And my competence to manage commercial enterprises will be demonstrated by my success here in Kansas Territory. Which brings us to another concern, Blackwood continued smoothly. Your absence from St. Louis could be construed as abandonment of business responsibilities. The courts might determine that someone more qualified should assume management duties. The business is operating successfully under managers I appointed before departing. All legal requirements are being met. Perhaps, but your personal situation here raises questions about your judgment. Living unsharpened in a frontier town, associating with questionable characters. His gaze moved dismissively over Coleman. Coleman's hand moved to rest on the table, and Sarah noticed. His knuckles were white with suppressed anger. Mr. Blackwood, I'd be careful about questioning anyone's character when you're the one who followed a woman across half the continent, after she made it clear she wasn't interested in your attentions. The direct challenge clearly rattled Blackwood, though he tried to maintain his civilized facade. Mr. Coleman, this is a family matter that doesn't concern you. Miss Mitchell and I are business partners. Her affairs concern me insofar as they affect our joint enterprises. Business partners? Blackwood's laugh held an unpleasant edge. How convenient. Sarah, surely you realize how this appears to respectable society. An unmarried woman in business partnership with a frontier cowboy? Sarah leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a level that carried clearly to nearby tables without seeming to raise it. Charles, I'm going to explain this once, very clearly, so there can be no misunderstanding. I left St. Louis to escape your unwelcome pressure. I have established a new life here based on my own choices and my own resources. I am not interested in your legal challenges, your business propositions, or your personal attentions. Return to St. Louis and pursue some other woman who might welcome your advances. Sarah, you're not thinking clearly. Frontier life has obviously affected your judgment. Come back to St. Louis where you belong, and we can resolve these estate matters properly. I belong where I choose to be, which is here in Kansas Territory. My father's estate was resolved properly according to his wishes and legal requirements. And my judgment is functioning perfectly well. Blackwood's pleasant mask finally slipped completely. You think you can build some kind of life in this wilderness? You're a city-bred woman with no understanding of frontier realities. When winter comes, when the cattle market collapses, when your cowboy partner decides he needs a woman who can actually contribute to ranch work instead of playing at business, you'll come crawling back to St. Louis begging for security. Coleman started to rise, his expression dangerous, but Sarah placed a restraining hand on his arm. This was her battle, and she intended to finish it herself. Charles, your fundamental error is assuming I need anyone to provide me with security. I have my own resources, my own capabilities, and my own determination. What I don't need is a man who sees marriage as a business acquisition and women as property to be managed. You'll regret this foolishness, Sarah. I'll pursue legal remedies to protect your father's legacy from your reckless decisions. You're welcome to try. My attorneys in St. Louis will be happy to defend against any frivolous challenges. Now, if you'll excuse us, Mr. Coleman and I have legitimate business matters to attend to. Sarah rose from the table with dignity intact, Coleman beside her. As they prepared to leave, Blackwood made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. Sarah, one last question. What happened to the mail-order marriage you were supposedly pursuing? Did your intended husband take one look at you and decide to find himself a more suitable frontier wife? The cruel question was clearly intended to humiliate her publicly, but Sarah had learned too much about herself in the past few days to be wounded by such petty attacks. My intended husband died in an accident before I arrived. Unlike some people, however, I don't pursue relationships where I'm not wanted. Good day, Charles. They left Blackwood sitting alone at his table, his expensive suit and civilized manners, looking increasingly out of place among the practical businessmen who populated the hotel dining room. Outside on the street, Coleman finally released the anger he had been controlling throughout the confrontation. What a thoroughly unpleasant individual. Does he really have any legal standing to challenge your inheritance? None whatsoever. Though he might try to create expensive legal complications, Charles always preferred manipulation to direct confrontation. Well, he picked the wrong woman to manipulate. You handled that perfectly. Sarah appreciated the compliment, though. She was already thinking ahead to the larger implications of Blackwood's presence in Dodge City. Jake, I'm concerned about the timing of his arrival. Yesterday we encountered Marcus Whitfield watching me. Today Charles appears with legal threats. That seems like more than coincidence. Coleman's expression grew thoughtful. You think they might be working together somehow? I think we should find out. Two men arriving in Dodge City within days of each other, both with claims on my resources, both appearing immediately after I begin investigating Billy Harper's death. That suggests coordination rather than accident. How do you want to investigate the connection? Carefully and quietly. If they are working together, we need to understand their plan before we can counter it effectively. As they walked toward Coleman's office, Sarah noticed increased activity around the cattle pens and railroad loading areas. Cowboys were moving herds into position for shipping, while railroad cars stood ready to transport animals to Eastern markets. Is this unusual activity for this time of year? She asked. Peak shipping season. Most ranchers want to get their cattle to market before fall weather makes drives difficult. The next 6 weeks will be the busiest time of year for everyone in the cattle business. This information sparked an idea in Sarah's mind. Jake, if someone wanted to disrupt your business operations, when would be the most damaging time to do it? Coleman stopped walking, his expression becoming alert. Right now. If someone interfered with our contracted drives or damaged our relationships with clients, we could lose most of our annual profits. And if someone convinced your business partner to withdraw her investment at the same time, that would probably force us to shut down operations entirely. Coleman's voice carried new urgency. Sarah, you think Blackwood and Whitfield are planning to attack the cattle company as well as your personal situation? I think they underestimated both of us initially, but they're adaptable enough to expand their plans when circumstances change. They had reached Coleman's office, where Tom Bradley was waiting with a worried expression that suggested bad news. Boss, we've got problems with the Morrison contract. Someone's been spreading stories that our outfit isn't reliable, that we lost half of Morrison's herd last year due to poor planning. Coleman's face darkened. That's complete fabrication. We delivered Morrison's entire herd early and in excellent condition. Morrison knows that, but his financial backers in Chicago are getting nervous. They're demanding additional insurance and guarantees that could cost us most of our profit margin. Sarah absorbed this information while considering its timing. Tom, who specifically has been spreading these stories? Can't pin it down exactly, ma'am. Word just started circulating yesterday among the Railroad Buyers and Cattlemen's Association. The same day Marcus Whitfield appeared in town and began watching our activities, Coleman observed grimly. And the day before Charles Blackwood arrived with legal threats, Sarah added. Gentlemen, I believe we're under coordinated attack. Coleman and Bradley exchanged glances that confirmed they had reached the same conclusion. Boss, what's our response? Bradley asked. Information first. We need to understand exactly what we're facing before we can plan effective countermeasures. Coleman turned to Sarah. This has moved beyond simple business competition. If they're willing to spread false information about our operations, they might escalate to more direct sabotage. Sarah felt her anger crystallizing into cold determination. She had come to Kansas territory seeking a fresh start, and she had found something more valuable than security through marriage. She had discovered her own capacity for independence and leadership. She would not allow two manipulative men to destroy what she and Coleman were building together. Jake, I think it's time we took offensive action rather than simply responding to their moves. What do you have in mind? We give them what they think they want, but not in the way they expect. Let's arrange a public meeting where they can present their various claims and demands. Then we'll demonstrate exactly how wrong they were. About our vulnerabilities, Coleman smiled grimly. I like the sound of that. What kind of demonstration? Sarah's mind was already working through possibilities, combining her understanding of both Blackwood's and Whitfield's personalities with the realities of frontier business practices, the kind that uses their own arrogance against them. Charles expects me to be intimidated by legal threats. Marcus expects you to be vulnerable to rumors about business reliability. Let's show them both that they've miscalculated badly. Bradley listened to this exchange with growing interest. Ma'am, I don't know what you've got in mind, but if it'll shut down the varmints who've been spreading lies about our outfit, I'm ready to help however I can. Tom, how quickly could we organize a public meeting of cattlemen and business people? Something that would draw most of Dodge City's commercial leadership? Couple of days, maybe. What kind of meeting? Sarah looked at Coleman, seeing understanding begin to dawn in his eyes. A business opportunity presentation. Mr. Coleman and I are going to announce a major expansion of our partnership, one that will require substantial community involvement and support. And our two antagonists will naturally want to be present to hear about the resources they're hoping to claim, Coleman added. Exactly. But instead of the vulnerable targets they expect to find, they'll discover that they've united two people who are considerably more formidable together than either would be alone. As they began planning the details of their counterattack, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since her arrival in Dodge City just 3 days earlier. She had come seeking security through marriage to a man she had never met. Instead, she had found something far more valuable, a true partnership with someone who respected her capabilities and shared her determination to build something meaningful on the frontier. Charles Blackwood and Marcus Whitfield had made the mistake of assuming that a mail-order bride would be easy prey for their various schemes. They were about to learn that Sarah Mitchell was no longer the dependent woman who had fled St. Louis to escape an unwanted suitor. She had become someone capable of fighting for what she had chosen to build, and she intended to win. 3 days of intensive planning had transformed the Coleman Cattle Company office into a war room. Maps covered every available surface, correspondence filled neat stacks on the desk, and Sarah's careful handwriting documented their strategy in precise detail. The public business meeting they had organized for this Saturday afternoon would determine whether their counterattack succeeded or whether Blackwood and Whitfield's schemes would destroy everything they had begun to build together. Tom Bradley entered the office carrying the morning mail and wearing an expression that mixed excitement with concern. Boss, we got responses from every major cattleman and business owner in 3 counties. Near 60 confirmations for today's meeting. Word spread far beyond what we expected. Sarah looked up from the financial projections she had been reviewing. That's excellent news and a potential problem. The larger the audience, the greater our opportunity to establish credibility, but also the higher the stakes if something goes wrong. Coleman studied the list of confirmed attendees, noting names that represented significant influence in Kansas Territory's cattle industry. Some of these men control railroad contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. If we convince them of our expansion plans, we'll have more business opportunities than we can handle. If we fail to convince them, we'll be finished in this territory. Which is exactly what Blackwood and Whitfield are counting on, Sarah observed. They expect us to overreach and destroy ourselves through ambition. The past 3 days had revealed the scope of their adversaries' coordination. Whitfield had been systematically contacting Coleman's existing clients, planting doubts about the company's reliability and suggesting that Sarah's involvement indicated financial desperation. Meanwhile, Blackwood had been meeting with Dodge City's business establishment, presenting himself as Sarah's legitimate guardian and questioning her competence to manage substantial investments. Their strategy was sophisticated and potentially effective. By attacking both the personal and business dimensions of the partnership simultaneously, they hoped to isolate Sarah and Coleman from community support while undermining their commercial credibility. Sarah's counterplan was equally comprehensive but carried enormous risks. Instead of defending against their enemies' attacks, she and Coleman would announce a massive expansion of their operations, one that required community investment and support on a scale that would either establish them as major players in the territorial economy or expose them as fraudulent dreamers. Jake, are you certain the Henderson Ranch is actually available for purchase? Everything depends on our ability to deliver on the promises we'll make today. Coleman nodded firmly. Spoke with Old Man Henderson yesterday morning. His arthritis is getting worse, and he's ready to sell to someone who'll maintain his breeding program. $15,000 gets us 1,200 acres of prime grazing land, excellent water rights, and some of the finest cattle in Kansas. Territory. $15,000 represented nearly 8 times Sarah's available capital, but their plan didn't depend on her personal resources alone. If they could convince the territorial business community that the Coleman-Mitchell partnership represented a Kibris, sound investment opportunity, they could raise the necessary funds through a combination of bank loans and private investors. And the railroad contracts Tom mentioned? 3 confirmed opportunities if we can demonstrate sufficient capacity to handle large-scale operations. The biggest is a government contract to supply beef to military posts throughout the territory, worth $40,000 annually if we can meet their specifications. Sarah reviewed her calculations one final time. The numbers worked if everything proceeded according to plan, but frontier business rarely followed neat projections. Weather, disease, market fluctuations, and political changes could destroy even well-planned operations. Tom, what's the latest intelligence on Blackwood and Whitfield's activities? Bradley consulted notes he had compiled through conversations with bartenders, hotel clerks, and other sources of local information. Blackwood's been promising certain businessmen that he'll be managing Miss Mitchell's investments once the courts sort out her father's estate. Whitfield's been suggesting that Coleman Cattle Company is desperate for capital and willing to make unrealistic promises to attract investors. In other words, they're setting up the narrative that we're either fraudulent or incompetent, depending on how today's meeting unfolds, Coleman summarized. Exactly. If we fail to deliver convincing evidence of our capabilities, their alternative explanations will seem credible to people who don't know us well. Sarah stood and walked to the window overlooking Dodge City's main street. Saturday afternoon had brought the usual collection of cattlemen, railroad representatives, and merchants to town for business and socializing. Among them, she spotted both Blackwood and Whitfield moving through separate conversations with different groups of men. They're working the crowd already, laying groundwork for whatever disruption they're planning during our presentation. Coleman joined her at the window. Are you having second thoughts about this approach? We could still adopt a more defensive strategy, focus on protecting what we have rather than expanding aggressively. Sarah considered the question seriously. The conservative approach would be safer in the short term, but it would leave them vulnerable to continued attacks and manipulation. Blackwood and Whitfield had demonstrated their willingness to pursue long-term campaigns of interference. Defensive measures might delay their success but wouldn't eliminate the threat permanently. No second thoughts. If we're going to establish ourselves in this territory, we need to do it decisively. Half measures will only prolong the conflict. Bradley collected the maps and documents they would need for their presentation. I'll head over to the meeting hall and make sure everything's arranged properly. Boss, you and Miss Mitchell should arrive about 10 minutes after the scheduled start time. Let folks get settled and curious before you make your entrance. The meeting hall occupied the second floor of Dodge City's largest general store. Space normally used for community gatherings and traveling entertainments. Bradley had arranged tables and chairs to accommodate the expected crowd, while leaving space at the front for Sarah and Coleman's presentation materials. As Bradley departed to make final preparations, Sarah found herself alone with Coleman for the first time in days. The intensity of their planning had left little opportunity for personal conversation, though she had become increasingly aware of how naturally they worked together under pressure. "Jake, before we face this crowd, I want to be clear about something. If our plan fails today, I don't want you to feel responsible for my situation. I chose this partnership freely, and I'm prepared to accept the consequences of that choice." Coleman studied her face with the careful attention he gave to important business decisions. "Sarah, I appreciate that, but I want you to understand something too. This partnership has become more than a business convenience for me. Somewhere along the way, it became personal." The quiet admission hung in the air between them, acknowledging feelings that had been developing beneath their practical collaboration. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, though she wasn't certain whether from nervousness about the coming confrontation or from Coleman's unexpected declaration. "Personal, in what way?" "In the way that makes me want to protect what we've built together. Not just for business reasons, but because losing it would mean losing you too." Sarah moved closer to him, close enough to see the uncertainty in his eyes despite his steady voice. "Jake, you should know that I came to Kansas territory looking for security through marriage. Instead, I found something I hadn't expected to want: genuine partnership with someone who values my independence rather than trying to control it." "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that if we succeed today, if we establish ourselves as permanent partners in business, I'd like to explore the possibility of partnership in other areas as well." Coleman's expression shifted from uncertainty to something warmer and more determined. "Sarah Mitchell, are you proposing to me?" "I'm proposing that we consider expanding our partnership agreement to include more personal arrangements, assuming we're both still in business by this evening." Coleman's laugh held genuine pleasure despite the tension of their circumstances. "In that case, we'd better make sure our presentation succeeds. I'd hate to lose the opportunity to negotiate those expanded partnership terms." They sealed this tentative agreement with a brief but meaningful kiss, then collected their materials and headed toward the meeting hall. The next 2 hours would determine not only their business future, but also whether their personal relationship would have the opportunity to develop beyond mutual respect and growing attraction. The meeting hall buzzed with conversation as they approached the building. Through the windows, Sarah could see the room was nearly full, with men still arriving and claiming seats. The scale of attendance exceeded even their optimistic expectations, which meant their potential for success or failure had increased proportionally. "Ready?" Coleman asked as they paused at the foot of the stairs leading to the meeting room. "Ready," Sarah confirmed, though her heart was beating fast enough to make her wonder if everyone would be able to hear it during their presentation. They climbed the stairs together and entered the hall, their arrival causing a noticeable lull in conversation as 60 pairs of eyes turned to assess the partnership that had generated so much recent discussion. Sarah scanned the faces, noting expressions that ranged from curious to skeptical to openly hostile. Blackwood and Whitfield had positioned themselves at opposite sides of the room, ensuring that any disruption they planned could come from multiple directions. Coleman moved to the front of the room and raised his hand for attention. "Gentlemen, thank you all for attending today's presentation. My partner, Miss Sarah Mitchell, and I appreciate your time and interest in our expansion plans." A murmur ran through the crowd at his direct reference to Sarah as his partner. In a territory where women rarely participated in business meetings as anything other than observers, her active role challenged conventional expectations. "Before we begin," Sarah said, stepping forward with confidence she hoped appeared more genuine than it felt, "I'd like to address some rumors that have been circulating about our partnership and my personal circumstances." This direct approach caught the audience's attention immediately. Rather than ignoring their adversary's whisper campaign, she was confronting it publicly. "Some of you may have heard that I'm an inexperienced Eastern woman who doesn't understand frontier business realities. Others may have been told that I'm not competent to manage substantial investments, or that my partnership with Mr. Coleman represents some form of charity arrangement." Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his seat, apparently not expecting such a forthright response to his behind-the-scenes maneuvering. "I'm here today to demonstrate that both characterizations are incorrect. My background includes 3 years of active involvement in my father's grain business in St. Louis, managing everything from supplier contracts to financial planning. I understand profit margins, cash flow management, and risk assessment because I've been applying these principles successfully for years." She moved to display the first of their carefully prepared charts, showing projected costs and returns for various expansion scenarios. "More importantly, I've committed substantial personal capital to this partnership because I believe Mr. Coleman's expertise combined with adequate investment funding can dominate the cattle market in Kansas Territory." Coleman took over the presentation, explaining their proposed acquisition of the Henderson Ranch and the operational expansion it would enable. His knowledge of the cattle business impressed even the skeptical faces in the audience, while his practical experience countered any suggestion that their plans were based on unrealistic expectations. "The Henderson property gives us the capacity to handle government contracts requiring delivery of up to 500 head per month. Current market conditions suggest these contracts will be available for at least 3 years, generating revenue that justifies our initial investment while establishing our reputation for large-scale operations." A voice from the middle of the room interrupted the presentation. "Coleman, we've heard stories about your outfit's reliability problems. How do we know you can handle contracts that size when there's talk you've lost herds due to poor planning?" Sarah recognized the speaker as one of the men Whitfield had been speaking with before the meeting. The question had been planned to introduce doubts at a critical moment in their presentation. Coleman addressed the challenge directly. "That's an interesting question, especially since it's based on completely fabricated information. I invite anyone in this room to contact my previous clients and verify our actual track record. Every contract we've completed has been delivered on time and in full." "Easy to say when you're trying to raise money," another voice called out. This speaker was sitting near Blackwood's position. Sarah stepped forward before Coleman could respond. "Gentlemen, since there seems to be some confusion about our credibility, let me make a proposal that should resolve any doubts." The room fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Mr. Coleman and I are prepared to execute our Henderson Ranch purchase immediately, using funds I'll provide through a bank draft drawn on my St. Louis accounts. Furthermore, we're prepared to guarantee our government contract commitments with a performance bond of $10,000. Gasps rippled through the audience. $10,000 represented more than most frontier businessmen saw in several years. Sarah's willingness to risk such a sum demonstrated either remarkable confidence or spectacular foolishness. Blackwood stood abruptly. "This is preposterous. Sarah doesn't have access to funds of that magnitude. I'm her father's former partner. and I can assure you that her claims about her inheritance are grossly exaggerated." Sarah had expected this challenge and prepared for it accordingly. "Mr. Blackwood, thank you for providing this opportunity to clarify the situation publicly." She reached into her satchel and withdrew a folder containing documents she had requested by telegram from her St. Louis bank. "These are certified financial statements showing my current account balances, along with documentation of my legal ownership of Thornton Grain Company. The total verified assets exceed $35,000. The papers circulated through the room, examined by men who understood enough about financial documents to recognize their authenticity." Sarah watched Blackwood's face drain of color as his foundation claim about her limited resources crumbled publicly. "Furthermore," Sarah said firmly, "Mr. Blackwood holds no legal claim to my father's estate or business interests. His employment ended the day my father died, and he has no ownership in any of the assets I inherited." Coleman stepped forward to stand beside her, a clear show of solidarity. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing the gathered investors, "Miss Mitchell brings considerable assets and proven business acumen to our venture. Combined with our operational expertise, we're the most capable outfit in Kansas Territory for combined with our operational expertise. We're the most capable outfit in Kansas Territory for executing large-scale contracts." Judge Wesley Morrison, a towering figure in territorial politics, rose from his seat and eyed Sarah carefully. "Miss Mitchell," he said, "your financial records are impressive. But what guarantees do we have of your long-term presence here? What's to stop you from returning to St. Louis once your investments bear fruit?" Sarah had anticipated the question. She met his gaze steadily. "That's a fair concern, Judge. To demonstrate my permanent commitment to this territory, I'm pleased to announce that Mr. Coleman and I are engaged to be married. Our partnership will be both personal and professional." The announcement sent a ripple through the room. A marriage would not only secure her place in the territory, but also quiet any whisper of impropriety in her dealings with Coleman. Dave took her hand with convincing warmth. "I'm honored Miss Mitchell accepted," he said. "Our marriage will deepen our partnership and ensure our investments bring lasting value to Kansas Territory." Blackwood surged to his feet, his face red with fury. This is clearly a calculated move to shield her assets from legitimate claims. No respectable woman would consent to such a transactional arrangement. Sarah turned to him, her voice ringing across the hall. "Mr. Blackwood, your mistake is in assuming any woman would need to be desperate to choose a life of independence and equal partnership over your particular brand of courtship." The blow landed hard. Blackwood's composure cracked. "You ungrateful girl. I offered you status and security in St. Louis, and you're throwing it away on some backwoods fantasy with a man who can't even provide you with civilized comfort." Sarah's voice sharpened. "Charles, the only comfort I care about is the freedom to make my own decisions, without interference from men who view women as property to be controlled." Judge Morrison struck the floor with his cane, restoring order. "This personal matter is irrelevant. Miss Mitchell, Mr. Coleman, do you have a specific proposal for investment?" Coleman nodded and smoothly transitioned into their presentation, laying out an opportunity for local investors to buy shares in their expanded operation. The projected returns were strong, far better than most ranchers could achieve on their own. But as he wrapped up, Sarah noticed Whitfield whispering to several men nearby, clearly organizing some form of resistance. Whatever was coming, he was preparing to challenge them publicly. Moments later, Whitfield stood, wearing the practiced expression of someone reluctantly sharing unpleasant news. "Gentlemen, I don't wish to disrupt Mr. Coleman's fine presentation, but I believe you deserve full transparency before committing your resources." The room quieted. All eyes turned to him. "My late business partner, Billy Harper, left me in charge of his ranch. Since then, I've uncovered troubling evidence linking Mr. Coleman's outfit to more than just the stampede that took Billy's life. The accusation landed with a jolt. This wasn't a challenge to their finances. It was a direct attack on Coleman's character. What evidence are you referring to? Judge Morrison asked sternly. Whitfield pulled a folder from his coat. Documents indicating that Mr. Coleman's company intentionally introduced diseased cattle into Billy's herd. The infection destroyed his breeding stock. The stampede was merely the final step in a deliberate effort to ruin him likely to acquire his land. The sheer audacity of the claim left Sarah stunned. Whitfield had twisted a tragic accident into a calculated act of sabotage. Coleman, visibly shaken, was nearly speechless. That's a blatant lie, he finally said, voice tight with anger. Anyone who knew Billy knows I had no reason to harm him. Unless, of course, Whitfield said smoothly, his land was standing in the way of your expansion. Billy owned some of the best grazing land in the territory. His death opened up opportunities that benefit you directly. Sarah felt the mood in the room shifting as men began to consider whether Whitfield's allegations might explain Coleman's apparent success and her substantial investment in his operations. This was the crisis moment they had prepared for, though not in the specific form they had anticipated. Everything they had built together, every plan they had made, hung in the balance as 60 influential men waited to see how they would respond to charges that could destroy them, both personally and professionally. The silence in the meeting hall stretched taut as 60 men absorbed Whitfield's shocking accusation. Sarah felt the weight of their collective scrutiny, the careful neutrality of frontier businessmen who understood that backing the wrong side in such a dispute could cost them dearly. Everything she and Coleman had worked toward hung in the balance of the next few minutes. Coleman's voice, when he finally spoke, carried a deadly calm that was somehow more intimidating than shouting would have been. Marcus, that's an interesting story. I'm curious where you obtained these supposed documents proving deliberate sabotage. Whitfield held up the folder with apparent confidence. Billy kept meticulous records of his cattle operations, including veterinary reports and breeding schedules. The evidence shows a clear pattern of Coleman's diseased animals being introduced to Billy's healthy herds. Sarah studied Whitfield's demeanor carefully. His accusation was so specific and devastating that it had to be either completely true or a desperate fabrication designed to destroy Coleman's reputation permanently. Given what she had learned about Whitfield's character, fabrication seemed more likely, but proving it would require careful strategy. Mr. Whitfield, she said, stepping forward with the same controlled composure she had used in confronting Blackwood, those are serious accusations. I assume you're prepared to have those documents examined by independent experts? Something flickered in Whitfield's eyes, too quickly for most of the audience to notice, but Sarah caught it. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear, suggesting that his evidence might not withstand close scrutiny. Of course, the documents speak for themselves. Judge Morrison stood again, his authority commanding immediate attention. This is a serious matter that requires proper investigation. Mr. Whitfield, I'll ask you to surrender those documents to Sheriff Davies for examination. If your allegations prove true, criminal charges may be warranted. This suggestion clearly rattled Whitfield, though he tried to maintain his confident facade. Naturally, I want justice for Billy Harper. But these documents are the only copies of irreplaceable records. Coleman seized on this hesitation. If they're genuine ranch records, there would be corresponding entries in Billy's bank deposits, feed purchases, and veterinary bills. All of that information would be available through official channels. Sarah added another layer of pressure. Furthermore, if Mr. Coleman had been systematically sabotaging Billy's operation, there would be witnesses among the cowboys who worked both ranches. Men don't keep secrets well in small frontier communities. Tom Bradley spoke up from his position near the back of the room. Boss, I worked roundup with Billy's outfit twice in the past year. Never saw anything but straight dealing between your operation and his. Billy himself said you were the most honest cattleman he'd worked with. Other voices began supporting Bradley's assessment. Cowboys and small ranchers who had observed both operations contradicted Whitfield's allegations with specific examples of cooperation and mutual assistance. Whitfield's confident expression was cracking under the weight of contrary testimony. You're all protecting Coleman because you depend on his business. Of course you'd support his version of events. Sarah recognized this as the moment to press their advantage decisively. Mr. Whitfield, there's a simple way to resolve this dispute. If your documents are genuine, they'll contain details that only someone with intimate knowledge of Billy Harper's operation could know. Details that wouldn't be available to someone fabricating evidence. She moved closer to Whitfield, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. For instance, Billy mentioned in his letters to me that he had marked his breeding bulls with a specific brand design that incorporated his initials. If your veterinary records are genuine, they would reference those brand marks when identifying which animals were affected by alleged disease. Whitfield's face went pale. Either he hadn't thought to include such specific details in his fabricated documents, or Sarah had called a bluff he wasn't prepared to meet. The documents contain all necessary identification details, he said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Coleman stepped forward with renewed determination. Then you won't mind if we examine them right now. Judge Morrison, I request that Mr. Whitfield read aloud the brand descriptions for any cattle mentioned in his alleged veterinary reports. The request trapped Whitfield perfectly. If he refused, it would suggest his documents were fraudulent. If he agreed and his fabricated papers lacked the specific details Sarah had referenced, his deception would be exposed publicly. Whitfield opened the folder with hands that trembled slightly, scanning pages that apparently didn't contain the information he needed. His hesitation stretched long enough to convince most observers that something was wrong with his evidence. The brand descriptions are technical details that wouldn't be meaningful to this audience, he finally stammered. Sheriff Davies stood from his position near the door. Mr. Whitfield, I'll need to examine those documents immediately. If they contain evidence of criminal activity, withholding them from law enforcement would be obstruction of justice. Faced with official demand for evidence he knew wouldn't withstand scrutiny, Whitfield made the fatal error of trying to retreat. These are private papers that require proper legal handling. I'll need to consult with attorneys before releasing them. The transparent evasion convinced even the most skeptical members of the audience that Whitfield's accusations were fraudulent. Judge Morrison's expression hardened with the displeasure of a man who valued integrity above all other qualities. Mr. Whitfield, your refusal to provide evidence for serious criminal allegations suggests that no such evidence exists. Sheriff Davies, I recommend you investigate whether Mr. Whitfield has been filing false reports or attempting to defraud this community. Whitfield realized his position had become untenable. His scheme to destroy Coleman through fabricated accusations had backfired spectacularly, exposing him as a liar before the most influential businessmen in Kansas Territory. This is all a misunderstanding, he said desperately. I was only trying to protect Billy Harper's memory from those who might exploit his death for personal gain. Sarah delivered the final blow with surgical precision. Mr. Whitfield, the only person who has exploited Billy Harper's death is the one who continued writing letters in his name to deceive a mail-order bride. The one who has been maintaining Billy's ranch while pretending to have no connection to the property. The one who fabricated criminal accusations when his other schemes failed. The accusation hit Whitfield like a physical blow. Several men in the audience stood as the implications became clear, their expressions shifting from confusion to anger as they understood the scope of his deception. Blackwood, recognizing that his ally's exposure threatened his own position, tried to deflect attention. These frontier dramatics don't address the serious legal issues regarding Sarah's inheritance. The courts will still need to review. Charles, Sarah interrupted with finality that silenced the room. The only court review you'll face is the one where I sue you for harassment and attempted fraud. My inheritance is secure, my business partnerships are legitimate, and my personal choices are none of your concern. She reached into her satchel and withdrew a telegraph message that had arrived that morning. This communication from my St. Louis attorneys confirms that they've filed restraining orders against any attempts to interfere with my legal affairs. Any further harassment will result in criminal charges. Coleman moved to stand beside Sarah, presenting the united front that had sustained them through every challenge they had faced. Gentlemen, I think we've wasted enough time on these disruptions. Are there any legitimate questions about our business proposition? Judge Morrison consulted with several other influential men before addressing the room. Mr. Coleman, Miss Mitchell, your handling of these attacks demonstrates exactly the kind of character and competence our territory needs. I'm prepared to invest $5,000 in your expansion plans. This endorsement opened the floodgates. Within minutes, offers of investment and partnership filled the air, as men competed to associate themselves with what was clearly going to be a successful and influential operation. Harold Winters approached with a broad smile. Miss Mitchell, your demonstration of business acumen today was impressive. I'd like to discuss exclusive contracts for all your lumber needs. Dr. James Howard added his support. Coleman, if you're planning to expand throughout the territory, you'll need reliable medical services for your cowboys. I'd be honored to serve as your company physician. Even the railroad representatives who had been observing quietly moved forward to discuss shipping contracts and expanded service to support the Coleman-Mitchell operations growth. Within an hour, Sarah and Coleman had received investment commitments exceeding $20,000. Partnership proposals from major territorial businesses, and enough cattle contracts to keep them busy for the next 3 years. Whitfield and Blackwood slipped out during the celebration, their schemes in ruins and their reputations destroyed. Neither would find welcome in Kansas Territory's business community again. As the formal meeting dissolved into individual negotiations, and congratulations, Sarah found herself momentarily alone with Coleman near the front of the room. The transformation of their situation from desperate defense to overwhelming success still felt surreal. I can hardly believe how completely the tables turned, she murmured, watching respected businessmen compete for their attention. Coleman's expression mixed satisfaction with something deeper. Sarah, there's something I need to clarify about our engagement announcement. I know we agreed it was tactical, but standing here beside you, watching you demolish our enemies with pure intelligence and courage, I realize something important. What's that? I don't want this to be just a business arrangement anymore. Somewhere between your arrival in Dodge City and this moment, I fell in love with the remarkable woman you've shown yourself to be. Sarah felt her heart accelerate. Though whether from surprise, pleasure, or nervousness, she couldn't determine. Jake, are you proposing to me for real this time? I'm saying that if you're willing to consider it, I'd like our marriage to be genuine rather than just strategic. But I want you to choose freely, not because our business success depends on it. Sarah studied his face, seeing vulnerability beneath the confidence that had carried him through their public confrontation. This man had risked his reputation and his business to support her independence. He had treated her as an equal partner. In every decision, valued her intelligence, and stood beside her against enemies who had underestimated them both. Jake Coleman, I came to Kansas Territory looking for security through marriage to a man I'd never met. Instead, I found something I hadn't dared to hope for. Genuine partnership with someone who values my strength rather than trying to diminish. Is that a yes? That's a yes to a real engagement, a real marriage, and a real partnership in every sense of the word. Coleman's smile transformed his serious features completely. In that case, Mrs. Coleman-to-be, I think we should celebrate our engagement properly. He kissed her thoroughly, despite their public setting, drawing cheers and applause from the businessmen who were still conducting negotiations around them. Judge Morrison approached with documents already prepared. Miss Mitchell, Mr. Coleman, if you're serious about this engagement, I can perform the ceremony next Sunday after church. The whole territory will want to celebrate your wedding. Sarah looked at Coleman, seeing her own excitement reflected in his eyes. What do you think? Ready to make this partnership permanent? I've been ready since you demolished Charles Blackwood's pretensions and exposed Marcus Whitfield's lies. Any woman who can handle adversaries that ruthlessly while maintaining perfect composure is exactly the partner I want for life. As the sun set over Dodge City, casting golden light through the meeting hall windows, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She had arrived as a desperate mail-order bride, seeking security through marriage to a stranger. Instead, she had discovered her own capacity for independence, leadership, and love with a man who respected every aspect of her strength. The burned ruins of her original expectations had provided the foundation for something far more valuable. A true partnership built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and genuine affection. The cattle drives, business contracts, and territorial expansion represented more than commercial success. They symbolized the life she and Coleman would build together on the frontier, one based on their own choices rather than social conventions or other people's expectations. Billy Harper's death had been tragic, but without that tragedy, she never would have met Jake Coleman or discovered her own capabilities as a frontier businesswoman. Whitfield and Blackwood's schemes had been malicious, but their attacks had forced her to demonstrate strength she hadn't known she possessed. Standing in the meeting hall, surrounded by men who now respected her business judgment and treated her as an equal, Sarah understood that she had found something more valuable than the security she had originally sought. She had found the freedom to become whoever she chose to be, supported by a partner who celebrated her independence rather than trying to control it. The mail-order bride who had stepped off the train in Dodge City 5 days earlier no longer existed. In her place stood Sarah Mitchell, soon to be Sarah Coleman, successful businesswoman, equal partner, and frontier pioneer ready to build whatever future she and Jake decided to create together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.